I'm just going to kick us off. Hello, welcome everyone. We do have at least one more panelist on the way. But thank you for coming here bright and early on a Saturday morning. If this is like other versions of this panel, people are going to be filtering in. My name is Aaron Robertson. I am the Communications Director for Oregon Wild. And I put together this panel every once in a while just to help people understand what things are what it's like and how to be better at doing my job, and how my job and jobs of people in the community and in organizations can help reporters, journalists tell our stories. What kind of things, resources we can give them, how we can make sure that we are respecting their time, so we can prepare and get the stories in our communities on the things that we care about, get those told in the best way possible. So right now I have two panelists here and another one power walking on the way. Brian Ball is a journalist and proud member of the Nez Perce tribe whose career spans public radio, print, and digital media. He's reported for NPR affiliates, including KLCC here in Eugene, Wisconsin Public Radio, South Dakota Public Radio, with work also appearing in Indian Country Today, The Oregonian, and People's Magazine, and reports indigenous stories from the Pacific Northwest for Buffalo's Fire. Brian is the recipient of more than 100 honors, including multiple national Edward R. Murrow Awards and recognition from the Indigenous Journalists Association. He was a professor at the U of O School of Journalism and Communications from 2023 to 2025.
Morning. Nice to see everyone.
Next we have Kendra Chamberlain. Kendra Chamberlain is an Oregon-based freelance investigative journalist covering environmental and energy issues. Her work spans local government, political reporting, business, and in-depth explorations of renewable energy and emerging technologies. She previously served as the environmental reporter for the New Mexico Public Report. Is it New Mexico or is it just NM?
New Mexico, yeah.
And has written for outlets including Columbia Insight, Investigate West, and High Country News. And we have Camilla Mortensen. Camilla is the editor-in-chief of the Eugene Weekly, Lane County's print and digital alt weekly. An award-winning journalist, she has earned national and regional honors for reporting and editorial writing, and she has had the unique experience of pulling her paper back from the threat of having completely shut down.
Yeah, that was fun.
Camilla teaches journalism at the University of Oregon and Lane Community Colleges, advises the LCC student newspaper The Torch, and serves on the board of the Highway 58 Herald. I'll kick things off with a few moderator questions, some of them directed to the whole panel, some of them to individuals, and then of course we'll have plenty of time to open it up for your questions. Nice little intro question here from me. Can you briefly describe your role and what environmental reporting looks like in your newsroom or professional world right now?
I'll go ahead and start since I have the microphone right next to me. Hi. Tatsmewe, good morning. Brian Bull. I am a member of the Nez Perce tribe, or as we call ourselves, the Namipu. I am a freelance contributor to KLCC, which is the NPR affiliate here in Eugene, and will sometimes get a piece on national. I also am the substitute host for National Native News, and am a full-time reporter for Buffalo's Fire, buffalosfire.com, and we are a Native American-led news organization based out of Bismarck, North Dakota, but they let me work and cover stories out of the Pacific Northwest. And it's a pretty wide umbrella that we cast. Environmentalism and Native American communities are very much hand in hand. We're often seen as the original stewards of the land, protectors, and at the same time, people are often surprised to know that there are tribes out there that own mineral rights and timber stands, and that they use to leverage for economic development. And so what does that look like from an environmental point of view? We often look into issues of land back and protecting natural resources and reintegrating our way of life, and also trying to accommodate more modern ways of incorporating our mission. But yeah, it's a pretty wide open area in terms of approaching environmentalism. Generally, what I have seen is that there are a lot of people who are very concerned now because we have seen such a disruption at the federal level, which of course has ripple effects through states and tribal governments and ways that the tribes try to communicate with the upper levels of government to try to create that or reinforce that tribal government-to-government relationship to make sure that we have a say in matters that affect our communities and, of course, the environment. So, yeah, it's a fascinating issue to tackle, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Hi, I'm Kendra. I think, as a freelancer, I have kind of some different pockets that I like to cover. A lot of it is kind of just boils down to industry versus environmentalism. Sorry, am I not speaking that enough? Okay. And yeah, the industry side, I've covered environmental issues across 3 different states, Louisiana, New Mexico, and now here in Oregon. I feel like the issues are kind of becoming, the stakes are raising, I guess. Every time we have a weird winter or a really hot summer or a heat dome, these things are kind of becoming more urgent, and that's kind of informing, I think, coverage right now. And the other thing that I do is I write about how technology can help environmental issues, which is kind of an intersection that is not super well covered right now. And there's a lot of technological solutions to a lot of our problems that I think are flying under the radar right now. That's something I'm interested in.
Well, I have the unique perspective of working at an alternative weekly, which unfortunately there's fewer and fewer of, but as an alt weekly, we are covering Lane County, but we actually cover all of Oregon as well, because our goal is to fill in what other news outlets are missing, which, and as there's fewer and fewer other news outlets, there's more and more gaps to fill in. We also aren't, since we're not rushing, as you can tell by the fact I took a while to get here, since we're not rushing to get the story out, we also can take the time, hopefully, to do things that are a little more in-depth. And we're also looking for the angle that others might be missing. And as an instructor of journalism, one of the things we say is that journalism is objective in method. That is not the same as journalism is objective. We use objective methods to understand how to portray a story. You can interview all the sides of an issue and still figure out that the environment is the linchpin and the key. Some people will see that as bias. You have to use the objective method to come to that. That is sort of the direction we're coming from. We also do run a lot of opinion pieces. It's clearly marked separately from what else we run, but we run opinion pieces and give the chance for voices to be heard. I hate the expression unheard or unvoiceless, because people aren't voiceless, animals aren't voiceless. We're often just not hearing them. And that's a big goal of Alternative Weekly, is to make sure that folks or issues that aren't getting heard do get heard.
Thank you. Some of you touched on this in the previous question, but what feels different about covering these issues in the environment now than it did 5, 10, or 15 years ago?
This time I'll start because I have the microphone. I think one thing that I'm really glad for the newsroom I'm in is we actually have history. And so I can look at the things that we are covering now from the perspective of 5, 10, 15 years ago. Like, I'm watching the news about the gold mine being approved in Eastern Oregon, and I'm like, dude, I covered that gold mine back in like 2010 or something when it was first proposed, and the uranium mine. And I talked to the nearby Indian tribe about the pros and cons of what was going on there. So that, I think, is really unique. I think someone who has a longer perspective than me might say it differently, but in terms of reporting, I definitely feel like both the environment and newsrooms are more under threat than I have ever experienced. This is not the first time that I have seen the FBI surfing our pages, and we can see who's been on our page. I'm like, oh, look, the FBI is on there again. That's more to do with protesting in Iran. But just sort of looking at the decisions coming down, we had a piece this week by Attorney Dan Galpern sort of showing how some of the ways that Trump is making decisions about war are using the same techniques as he is using to make decisions about climate change. And I do think that giving voice to the environment and what's going on is as important or more important than ever before, as we're sort of trying to stop this Sisyphean rock from rolling down. It feels just more dangerous and more desperate than it has in a really long time.
Yes, I agree with all of that. And I also think we're kind of at an interesting time with regard to, if we're going to include climate change as environmental journalism, which I would, it's really impacting every sector of our life at this point, which is kind of interesting because that's new. Usually environmental is a silo. And now with climate change, it's very much not a silo anymore. It's impacting everything. And I think that's a great opportunity to bring conversations about the environment and how we steward it or don't steward it to the forefront of it, readers who are maybe interested in public health or industry, again, those sorts of things. So it's almost hard to deny now that the environment needs to take a more central role in our day-to-day lives, which is an opportunity, and it's also, as Camille said, very scary.
I think one thing that has really changed a lot in about the last 5 to 10 years is that climate and the environment are being removed, not necessarily denied, as previous administrations have done in the past. If you brought up climate change, global warming, some politicians would simply say, well, let's push back on that and explore. Is it really that case? But in the current administration, we are seeing documents, scientific documents circulating through the White House and other offices being essentially redacted, where terms like climate change are not even being allowed. There's a kind of a revisionist look at the environment in terms of policy, which I have never seen before, ever. And so, again, it's not just that there's debates being held about these terms, but it just seems to be almost a complete eradication denial that they exist, which bodes pretty ominously for terms of policy going forward, because many other countries acknowledge global warming, climate change. The United States under President Trump backed out of the Paris Accords. And so we're seeing almost a complete removal of the most, arguably one of the most influential governments walking away from the table and leaving partners kind of confused as to, where was America now in terms of trying to make policy happen, trying to acknowledge that there are changes happening. We're seeing that repercussions through things like drawing back on automobile design. I believe that in the last year, the Trump administration recanted some of the new changes that the Biden administration put forward in terms of fuel efficiency and reducing exhaust emissions. So it's kind of a widespread assault, I think, happening. And so a lot of other things that I think that kind of trail off of, and by the way, I ramble in the morning. I don't really get my shit together till 1 in the afternoon, so forgive me if I'm not completely coherent. But what I am seeing also is that a lot of environmental groups, coalitions, are now being forced to do more with less. We've seen a lot of, I think, a very aggressive attacks on environmentalism in general from the federal and sometimes the state level, depending where you're at. And so there's coalitions, partnerships being formed, and just groups trying to do more with dwindling resources than we've seen before. So that is very concerning.
You talked about how you're a statewide publication to cover things that aren't being covered. How do you make that determination of what, because obviously there are a lot of stories across the state that aren't being covered. What is your process for figuring out which one of those to tackle?
That's the joy of being the editor. I read voraciously. I read the Oregonian, I read the Register Guard, I listen to NPR, I also read all the small papers, but I also try to, like I say, network as much as possible with people with boots on the ground, because it's usually where I get my best stories. When I mentioned the, years ago when I covered the gold mine, uranium mine, I was actually interviewing someone from Oregon Natural Desert Association about the gold mine, and he was like, oh, ha ha ha, I thought you were calling about the uranium mine. And I was like, what uranium mine? And no one had been covering that at the time. And so getting information that way, talking to people, hopefully as much as possible, building trust with communities that we are going to be exactly who we say we are and cover what we say we're going to cover, not surprise them. And I think that's really helpful. And then sometimes I will see a news outlet cover something and I'll reach out and be like, ask people, what did they miss? What didn't get in there? What angle wasn't addressed? Or I can sometimes see that angle myself. So I think that's sort of the main technique that I'll use. Also, we do use freelancers, and so a lot of freelancers are kind of constantly looking for stories, and they will come in and pitch something. And then finally, because I work with a lot of student journalists, and I teach at the journalism school, they're kind of amazing, the stuff that they come across and then come and pitch. And I will either publish them or I will help them so they can publish the different publications.
You gave me a wonderful transition to Kendra. What is it like being a freelancer? Like, how does that work? Like, how do you choose what stories and what is your process for pitching them?
Yeah, being a freelancer right now is very hard. There are so many really great journalists that have been recently laid off that are competing right now, so which is great for the readers, you know. But yeah, it's similar to what Camilla said. I think a lot of just ear to the ground. I'm on like a lot of chat groups and social media for local social media, and yeah, I can probably do a little bit of like divination, trying to figure out, pray to the editor gods, please accept my story. But a lot of things I think, in terms of like receiving press releases in your email or whatever, a few things kind of stand out to me. One is looking for a story that has nuance is always good, I think. I think sometimes press releases from like activist groups or environmental groups can be a little bit like black or white on their issue, but I try to look for nuance because I think that all stories are nuanced and that's better reporting anyways. And in terms of developing pitches, that's like a really just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks kind of situation. I find it's a lot easier to pitch a publication where I already know the editor, so introducing myself to editors is kind of like a big task that I have to do a lot of. And yeah, I think that I have an unusual sort of perspective in that I think that there's usually a story in everything. If you can tell it the right way, then it's probably going to be worth reading. And so I have a very open mind with that. And I also think that, creativity in pitches is always rewarded. And I think it's also something that we don't see a lot of necessarily in print media, I guess. Sometimes we don't see it, sometimes we do. With all weeklies are really great with creativity, but some other publications maybe are a little less dull, or more dull rather. But yeah, I think creativity and how you approach a topic is always rewarded, and that can be a collaborative effort between the journalist and the issue, the group, whatever. And how that's crafted and sent over to the editor. But it's kind of like applying for a job when you're a freelancer. You send a million emails and you probably won't hear back, and you just gotta keep trying over and over again until you get your foot in the door somewhere.
And I want to add something on the press release thing that's kind of a leaning, because it's kind of a question for you too. When I get a press release, I look at it, and if it went to every single news outlet and we all got the same press release, I'm going to table that. I'm just going to be like, everyone got this, it's going to get covered, it's a pretty standard story, I'm good to go. Some of the groups that I cover around here know that I do that. And so if they don't get coverage, they'll circle back around and call me, or they will give me a heads up ahead of time. Because again, I'm looking for that other angle, and sometimes they'll mistake it and be like, oh, you want it first. And I'm like, no, I don't need it first. I need it better, or I need it different. And I wonder if that's sort of something you might be looking at too as a freelancer. You're like, yeah, the Oregonians got that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to riff on that one too. If you get a press release, you don't have to be obligated to follow it to the letter and embrace the angle of that press release. What I found that kind of makes it more intriguing for a lot of my readers or my listeners is being able to kind of take a little piece of that press release and kind of add on to it or spin it to a different direction. Oregon State University gave me a couple press releases late last year that one had to do with, I believe, the perception of Santa people, people who adopt the role of Santa Claus. And there was some kind of, I think, an idea that people who weren't jolly or white or had a big puffy beard and, you know, a potbelly. They couldn't be Santas, but we were finding examples of people who were Santa Clauses for the respective communities. So we had, for instance, I found a Native American Santa who was coming through Springfield one weekend in December. There was another person who was, I found a pair of people who were drag Santa and drag Mrs. Claus, and they were showing up at a transponder event in Eugene about the following week later. So I went over and interviewed them. And then there was a black Santa who's been doing this for a number of years, actually a former KLCC radio host. And so if I stuck to just the press release and focused on this research that says, yeah, you know, if you really truly believe in the spirit of Christmas, you're going to be a great Santa, fine, interesting, but by finding examples of people who kind of broke that mold and made the Santa character their own and fitting with their own community, I ended up with this really fun 5-minute feature that I got a lot of great feedback on, saying here's how different communities are finding their own way to celebrate the holidays in ways that they can identify with. So if I'd only just glommed onto the press release verbatim, would have been an okay story, but by adding on those different elements and kind of using it as kind of a touchstone, it became a much stronger story.
Why don't you keep the microphone, Brian? You report on Indigenous issues for Indigenous audiences, and I'm wondering how reporting for those audiences might shape the way you frame environmental and natural resource stories.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I know that our readership is largely geared towards Native people. I feel the same way with National Native News whenever I substitute host. But I also kind of try to not just focus primarily on that lens. I try to think of the non-natives who might be in the audience, because I find that throughout my career that I cover Native news from an Indigenous perspective, but I almost always come across a lot of readers who are just really fascinated with Native people and Native culture and the Native perspective. And so there's a part of me that will sometimes write a story with kind of a historical aside, you know, kind of a, I don't know if I would call it an insider joke or something like that. When I speak about history, when I speak about humor and irony, there are certain elements to it that a Native person can understand that a non-Native does not necessarily get. Sometimes I'll incorporate that, I'll lean into it, but I still try to think of a very overall inclusive way of writing it, because I want not only, maybe preaching to the choir is quite not the right term here, but I know in some ways that I've got almost an automatic audience with the Native perspective, and they identify and they relate to it. But I also try to think of people who are outside who kind of want to get a little more invested into the issue and know a little bit more about it. I think one of the more recent examples could be the practice of fire. I don't know if anyone here has heard of either cultural burns or good fire, or more collectively they're known as prescribed burns. But the dialogue used to be mainly about, you know, forest fires are getting worse. Why is that? Well, there's climate change, of course. We have a government policy that's been in place for about 1.5 years about total suppression. You know, anytime you found a fire, I think it was either the USDA or the Department of Forestry mandated that if you spotted a plume anywhere, well, then that fire had to be out by 10 a.m. the very next day. Which, from a policy point of view, from a safety point of view, sounds good on paper. But what it did over the course of, you know, that 1.5 years is it generated slash. There was a lot of foliage, refuse, things that were just piling up that created these tinderbox conditions, especially with climate change. By kind of segueing in a little bit of the Native perspective, I was able to introduce the concept of prescribed or cultural burns as something that people did before colonization, that the indigenous peoples did in North America. And so it was a great way to kind of address the issue, but say, by the way, this is what Native people have been doing for millennia before colonization. They used to actually deliberately set fire to the landscape in terms of controlling pests like acorn weevils. They did it in a way to kind of rejuvenate certain plants and trees. Huckleberry stands, a Klamath firefighter told me that the women used to traditionally burn huckleberry bushes every 4 years as a way to kind of rejuvenate them and make sure that the berries were ripe and good and they grew out nicely. Different ways to kind of incorporate the fire discussion. And so it educated people, it got people onto the same page, and it still kind of addressed the issue of wildfire mitigation.
Come all the way back to Camilla. The Eugene Weekly, like most, if not all alt weeklies, has a very strong identity and an editorial voice. Do you think that that strong identity makes it easier or harder to hold decision makers or powerful actors accountable? Do you ever see the roles of an alt weekly kind of dismissed because, oh, it's just the alt weekly, and then how do you kind of counteract some of those attitudes?
Less so these days, I think, as newsrooms have shrunk. Right now, we're beginning endorsement season, and when you start getting everybody knocking on your door, and in fact, I know up in Portland and other areas, they basically say, if you want the Eugene vote, talk to the weekly, and people who pull out the endorsements, it terrifies me. They pull out the endorsements, they're like, what are your endorsements? I'm like, okay. But we also go through and we talk to everybody. I think there's some people, with any newspaper, you're not going to reach that section of that community. I'm never going to persuade with journalism the MAGA folks who just don't believe in climate change. That doesn't matter how objective or non-objective your story is, they're not going to be persuaded by it. They do really love getting on our Facebook page and all screaming at each other, which is, I'm like, we just really leaned into the commie rag thing. I'm like, yes, that's who we are, that's fine. No, I think well-written journalism is well-written journalism, and one of the things that I think is really great about what we're doing is not only do we work with the younger journalists, but we actually have some really wonderful, experienced investigative journalists that work with us and work with our students. So we work with Brent Walth, who did Fire Eden's Gate, the PiELC Prize winning journalist. He has a Catalyst journalism program, and he funds students to work for us. And he goes over their stories. So we have these very in-depth stories, and a lot of the words don't really mean that much, except for they sort of note the quality of the journalism, and our student journalists have beaten other Pulitzer Prize winners because the journalism is good. And I think that really is what it gets down to, is doing the best possible journalism. And if we do have a voice, in all honesty, I think we are more readable because of that voice. If you actually look at what we write, it's our choices in topic is very clear. There's a bias. We're going to cover the environment. We're going to do a positive story about the environment far faster than we're going to do a positive story about a new business. Like the new folks in town, look out, they were right over there at REI. They're like, oh my God, new REI. And I'm like, okay, but what else is there that's getting missed in terms of the effects of new construction and that type of thing? So yeah, yes and no. Some people are never going to read us, but I think if you read the stories, then the folks who need to know and understand are going to get reached.
We'll move down to Kendra. Freelancers often have more flexibility but less institutional backing. What are the challenges and advantages that come with being a freelancer?
Yeah, it's funny. I think earlier you had mentioned, how to not waste the journalist's time, and I was going to say, please waste my time. I am willing to hear anything within reason, I suppose. I feel like without institutional backing, a lot of times I have to convince sources that I'm not wasting their time, if that makes sense. Sometimes people, especially like big companies, they don't want to talk to a freelancer unless there's a story assured that's going to come out of it. So that's something I have to navigate a lot of. But yeah, I think kind of a trend that I'm seeing in freelance at least is, and probably this is true of wider journalism, there's a trend towards specialization. I mean, we used to call them beats. I guess we still call them beats. But that is kind of really siloing, once again, this idea of siloing coverage, and that can be a great advantage when you are almost, you're so, you have a history with a specific subject, then you almost become like a subject matter expert in that field, which can actually be very helpful for freelancing. And so that's a positive. I think also, though, there can be some negatives to that, especially when you're cold pitching, which is you have to call or email a new publication and they are not familiar with your work yet. You kind of have to prove yourself. And if you don't have that if you don't have an established beat that you've established yourself, and a portfolio that matches that. It can be very hard, I think, to convince a very busy editor that you're the right person to tell a specific story, or that you know what you're talking about when you pitch a story that maybe is new to them or not quite something that they would have thought of themselves. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right, Brian, back to you. And you've touched on some of this in some of your previous answers, but environmental issues often intersect with tribal sovereignty. What do journalists, advocates, communities frequently misunderstand about these issues? And what should we keep in mind when we're working on stories that involve indigenous nations and peoples?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I pick up on occasion is that there is a assumption that if there's an environmental issue or challenge or problem, that the tribes are going to be unified in their response to it. And tribes are very diverse. They have very different interests. I mentioned earlier that there are tribes out there that have interests in timber, minerals, mining, you name it, that they are trying to leverage again for their economic development. One of the lesser known stories, about 10 years ago, we had an incredible event happening in North Dakota at Standing Rock. A lot of people remember the No DAPL or No Pipeline protests, where thousands and thousands of Native people showed up from all over the country to show their opposition to this pipeline development. But one of the lesser known stories, and forgive me again because my mind never quite completely fires up until 1 in the afternoon, there was, I believe, a tribe, I can't remember if it was one of the North Dakota tribes or a neighboring South Dakota tribe, but one of the tribes actually had interests in both the land and in pipeline developments. They had a stake in the matter, and I am trying to, again, for the life of me, remember what the exact story was. But anyway, they had a pearl pipeline take on it. You're going to have to research that one. I apologize again, but there was just a brief blip in all the coverage that there's like a tribe somewhere to the north of all these protests saying, hey, actually, we'd benefit from that, and that'd be great for our community. So it's very, I think, important for journalists to not just assume that if there's an issue out there that could affect a tribe's livelihood, that everyone's going to gather around the wagon and say, yes, we're with you as a community. There are disagreements, there are disputes, there are matters of difference in the tribal communities. They can happen within tribes, they can happen between tribes, but there's always someone who's going to have some point of contention to raise, even when it looks like you would assume there would be uniform support or agreement on a particular matter.
What's working in journalism right now? Environmental journalism in particular. What feels the most promising?
I would just simply say that I think a lot of journalists, environmental and otherwise, are still rising to the occasion. I mean, we have seen an assault on free press. We have seen an administration that seems hell-bent on enforcing its reality, and I put that in quotation marks, upon the media. I mean, gaslighting began as a term shortly after the administration claimed that its the president's attendance at its first inauguration was record-breaking, when a lot of photographic evidence actually showed that it was lesser than the previous president's. But that didn't stop the administration from trying to enforce its own reality. What was the term? Alternative facts, I think, have been rolled out. And for a lot of people, it seems daunting, almost depressing to get up every day and look at the statements that are coming out of this administration and realizing that that does not match actual reality. We're seeing that happen now in Iran, where the administration has been holding back on the number of American personnel who've been killed or injured. They've tried to deflect blame on the deaths of roughly 180 schoolgirls, Iranian schoolgirls, and a Tomahawk missile traced to American forces. They're trying to shift that to Iran or Israel. Somehow Iran got its own Tomahawk missile and used it against their own school kids. But there's this one part that feels very distressing. But on the other hand, I am seeing so many journalists, both veteran and up-and-coming journalists, who are taking the challenge head on, and they are pressing forward with the truth. fact-checking as an industry, someone told me in the first administration shot up about 300%. That, previous to President Trump's first term, that fact-checking was just one of the things you did as a matter of course, maybe a day or two after the press conference. Now it has to happen in real time, simultaneously during State of the Union addresses and other important speeches, where a number of news outlets and fact-checking organizations are working around the clock and working in teams to kind of keep the flow of accuracy and truth going. And so, yeah, it's a lot more work than I ever imagined I would see us do as an industry, but I am also very encouraged that people are not letting these things go out there unchallenged.
I think that, well, first off, I'll say I have been working almost exclusively with nonprofit newsrooms now for a couple of years, and it's great. I think the nonprofit model is really great, and as we see the local news sort of atrophying away, I think nonprofit is great. Also, I work a lot with Columbia Insight, which is kind of unique because the coverage is the Columbia River Basin, which is a very wide area, but it's interesting to have a publication that is focused specifically on a watershed or, the basin. I really like that from an environmental perspective. I think that makes a lot of sense because obviously the basin is a unit. And there are many states, there's like 4 states, or 5, I guess technically, that have different politics and different policies, but they all impact the same basin. And so that's really cool. I hope that we can see more publications that are kind of using those types of boundaries instead of the imposed, state boundaries and stuff like that. But also I was gonna say, as a reader, I feel very down when I read national news, obviously. But I feel so empowered when I read local news. And a lot of the reason is because we can very easily impact local policy. And so it feels almost empowering to know what's going on at the local level, and then if you feel so called to act on that. And it's so sad that local journalism is kind of dying because it works, and we need to keep it alive for sure. And I wish that there was more. I wish that those models, ad-based models, any kind of model would work better for local journalism. It's hard to convince people these days that the local paper is worth reading. And that's, maybe not for the All Weekly, but for perhaps other papers like the Register Guard, sometimes it's very hard to convince people that it's worth a subscription fee. And it really, really is, both for your mental health and then also, to support your community journalism. And the other thing I was gonna say was as a reader of news, once again, I find that a lot of really great journalists that have been cut from their jobs migrated over to Substack. And that's really interesting to me because that is kind of like a reader-supported model that seems to be working for, once again, the subject matter expert journalists who have, a lot of authority in kind of niche sectors. They seem to be making some money doing that, enough to continue that. And there's a ton of really good journalism on Substack if you can stomach wading through the rest of the stuff. It's definitely worth checking out. And that's a model that I think other newsrooms may want to explore in the future.
I'm gonna agree and disagree with what Kendra was saying. The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. And I say that also because, the weekly did go down. We were embezzled. We lost all our money due to an office manager. I'm the editor. I don't run the money. That was the office manager. And when people found out, they rose up and brought the paper back. We only came back because people didn't want to lose their local media. And that, I think, said a lot. And it wasn't just local folks, it was people across the country and even outside of the United States. We were getting like $5 in the mail from some guy in New York. And I think that does say a lot about what people think about local journalism. And weirdly enough, also print media. We're supposed to be dead, and yet we're still printing 27,000 papers a week and getting them almost all picked up. The Register Guard is still around. They're still printing. The new digital newsroom is in town. They're getting the news out. We're actually really lucky here in Eugene. We've got the radio stations, the KLCC, that kind of thing. I'm definitely not going to be like not all media, because all media, we have something in common, a certain power or lack of power in common. But I think having diversity in media is hugely important. I think that having the national outlets is hugely important. I think even if the New York Times pisses me off, I need the New York Times to exist and their power to exist, that the power and the push they can have. I also need these small news outlets that people, these niche news outlets, you need that range of things, and readers need that range of things. And as well as diversity of funding. I think nonprofit is great. I love Investigate West. I love Cap Chronicle. I also think having a diversity of funding sources is hugely important. We are still partially ad-based at the Weekly. For some reason, people are still more interested in paying more for print ads than digital ads. Is that still, and readers respond to it really well, which is, it's interesting. We have a nonprofit arm, like a lot of papers do, and we have straight up reader contributions. And again, that also, I feel like, keeps the Weekly from being beholden. As much as we can say, like, just because this organization gave me a bunch of money doesn't mean anything. At the same time, like, knowing that we're getting it from all different angles. Back when Seneca Timber, and I don't control the ads either, when Seneca Timber was still around, they would take out ads in the Weekly, and I finally asked my ad guy, I was like, why are we getting ads from, like, Seneca? And he's like, oh, you piss them off all the time, they can't control your coverage, so they just take out an ad about how they're planting trees. And I'm like, that's evil and genius all at the same time.
Are there common mistakes you see from sources or advocates, and feel free to call me out on this, that make it harder for you to do good environmental journalism stories that get told well?
My instinct is to say yes, but I gotta back that up. Yes and no. Like trust and believe, like trust me with the information, trust me that I'm going to keep things off record that need to be off record, or your name out of it. But also like make sure I do, call me out. Let us know if we've made a mistake, but don't freak out if it's like my angle isn't exactly what you wanted to control. That's what your Substack is for. I think that on some level, knowing that transparency is really the goal of most media and getting information out there. I think that sometimes I've had advocates forget that, where they're like, why did you go call, the Forest Service? They're assholes. And I'm like, well, yeah, but they're the ones doing the timber sale. I have to talk to the power and ask the power questions, and I have to quote them. I'm not going to platform someone with a truly reprehensible viewpoint, but I am going to talk to them. I mean, it's not environmental, but it's for some reason coming to mind. We interviewed, those of you guys who are old enough to remember the Posies. The lead singer of the Posies was accused of sexual assault, and he was coming to town to give a show. And we interviewed him because he was doing a secret house concert. So we interviewed him, and he went on and on and on about how the women were just mad at him and vengeful because, he hadn't stayed with them and blah, blah, blah. We did the story, we maybe quoted him 2 of the things he said in the context of the story, because I did need people to know what he was saying. I didn't need to give him a column space to defend his reprehensible actions. He canceled the show.
I think, yeah, I think that the examples that are coming to my mind are all usually bigger companies or industry trying to mislead, which is, kind of par for the course. I will go back to my idea about nuance and how nuance is usually not a bad thing in journalism. And I think sometimes groups will be they'll be kind of hesitant to be open about the nuance of a particular issue, environmental issue specifically. And I think that that's a mistake. I think embracing nuance is always better. It usually makes for a better story. And, at the end of the day, the most important thing with journalism is just raising awareness about an issue, I suppose. And, if there is nuance, then it makes it more believable, more interesting. It's just a better product overall. And I that's the only kind of thing that I can think of. The industry people will lie outright, and then they'll get mad at you if you quote them directly, but in a way that they, it's, so the industry is its own thing. Talking to them is always fun. But yeah, for the environmental side, if you're not industry, I think that embracing nuance is good. And that's something industry doesn't like, is embracing nuance either, so.
I'm gonna walk back the thing I mentioned earlier about there being a tribe that was actually in support of the Keystone Pipeline, and just because I can't find it anymore, I swear. 10 years ago, I came across an article that said there was a tribe that did support the pipeline, but I can't find it now, so go ahead and strike that off your list. I'm still gonna research that and see if that was ever the case, but piling on to what Kendra and Camilla said, it's. I think the only other thing I would add in terms of mistakes to avoid is trying to dictate to the journalists what the story is and what it should be. You're welcome to pitch. You're welcome to suggest. You can certainly give perspectives that you want to have incorporated in it, but the journalists and the editorial team that they work with are going to review and see if that is the story or if there's more to be told. I'm trying to recall one incident I had many years ago back in South Dakota. There was a drying back of the waters. I think it had just been an unseasonably dry spring, and so some waters had kind of evaporated and pulled back, and it revealed this old village that used to be there, but then the dams were built and the backed up waters covered it, and so now this was now starting to reappear. And I forget the exact organization. There were some people on the West Coast. It might have been a Pacific affiliate, I'm not quite sure. But they said, Brian, we need you to get out there right now. And, oh, hello. Oh, was this in regards to the, okay. Oh.
You're right.
Okay, good. Interesting. And that is the Thunder View Petroleum Services, owned by the Mandan Hidatsa and the Renkra. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, go back and quote me on that. But what happened with the whole receding of the village and the waters is that this news organization said, okay, well, we need you to report that everyone is upset about this and that the South Dakota government needs to stop freeway development. I think there was a highway being developed there, and people were concerned about maybe old remains, and so it wasn't that it was a bad story. It was actually a very good story, but what they wanted me to do is, in that same day, tell my listeners that a boycott was in effect and the government was already suffering economically because of it. In the same day. It's like, no, I don't think it's gonna have that immediate effect. And then they came back later saying, okay, well, we're gonna send some reporters out there and we need you to put yourself in front of the bulldozers. And it's like, no, I'm not gonna do that either. They were very, very activist-minded, very impassioned, but they also wanted me to say that the things they wanted me to report on were already having an effect and the tide was turning. And it's like, no, that's just not the way it works. I observe, I report, but I don't participate. I observe and I cover and I try to do a very fair, balanced, and nuanced story, but obviously they had a very strong agenda in mind. So just trust the reporter to do their job and do it well. But if you're trying to take it over and make events happen that haven't happened yet, I'm gonna stop returning your calls.
I want to say something that kind of riffs off the pipeline thing. So
Yeah.
I'm actually going to go to things that advocates do well, which is the pipeline thing. Was making me think of it because I remembered it because we were actually covering that pipeline. And the reason we covered it is because I had an angle in, because there were folks from Lane County, from Eugene, Native American folks who were traveling over there to protest. That was my local angle in a national story. The other one, which was one of my favorite stories ever, I got a call from someone and she was like, hey, I've got a friend, she's protesting this crazy project, I want to bring her in to talk to you. And I was like, sure, who's your friend? And she's like, Winona LaDuke. And I'm like, bring your friend in. So Winona LaDuke comes in. This is before the pipeline was even a thing. This was actually the megaloads. I think I'm looking around, a couple of you guys remember this. I think at the time it was the megaloads that they were going to transport, they were using to transport the equipment to go to the tar sands, to do the extraction, to create the pipeline. So I hadn't even heard of the pipeline yet, and I was able to do a story
and do some serious digging on that particular story before it is even a thing. And it was because, again, do I cover Canada? No, not usually. Do I cover Montana, where most of the issue is? No, not usually. But I had this angle, this local angle in that I was able to cover it and dig things up, and wound up finding a pre-written finding of no significant impact that hadn't been even published yet because I had the time to dig around as an alt weekly. So giving the reporters that angle into something is always super useful.
Artificial intelligence and LLMs, what are the dangers? Are there opportunities? Hot takes? How that relates to journalism, and maybe specifically environmental journalism, given some of the environmental impacts that have been reported about energy costs, water, and things like that.
I'm definitely very cautious on AI, and a lot of that, one, is the environmental impact of it. And then also, as someone who also teaches journalism, we learn by writing. Like literally at the beginning of this, I said that we're objective in method. We need to do the methods and then write the story. And honestly, I say that there's the reader's version and there's the writer's version. The reader's version is the writer's version and the reader's version. I write my story, and it's the writer's version. It's me thinking through and understanding the characters, under whether the character is a human or a swamp. And then there's the reader's version, where I sort of turn it around and make it more comprehensible. If you let AI do that for you, then you're not truly thinking, you're not understanding. And I know I've talked to news outlets who do it to rewrite press releases, that kind of thing. I mean, I have the advantage of a small paper, so I'm just not going to use AI for any of that. There was several news outlets did the story of the counter-protesters that showed up at one of the protests in Springfield, and several news outlets also did the story of the guy who was arrested after threatening a woman with a gun. We were the only one to do the story, I think us and this one guy on YouTube, who did the story on how the guy with the gun who got arrested was the guy at the counter-protest, and he wasn't legally allowed to have a gun, and that's when you let AI do your press releases and you don't have that human thought. That said, yes, I tell my students, sure, use Grammarly, like check the story after you have finished it. That is a form of AI. But I'm always going to be open to using the tools, but I'm going to be very careful of the dangers of those tools.
Okay, so I use AI to transcribe my interviews because transcribing interviews is really boring. It's really awful. It used to take hours of my life, and now I just use Otter to do it. But you do have to check the transcriptions because sometimes they get it wrong. Actually, they get it wrong all the time. But what I was going to say was actually there is a lot of really interesting stuff that AI is doing in, once again, solving some of our problems in the environment. Not talking about writing stories or anything, but just cool things like using AI in fish passages to count the fish instead of, I don't know how you do it in dams and stuff. They literally have a window and somebody sits there and like counts the fish for a couple hours. And now you can use AI to do that. It gives you more accurate information. The AI is faster, so it can count like all the fish. It's really cool. We use AI now to track bumblebees in research on pollinators, like that kind of stuff. That's a great use of AI. Actually, it helps improve the science and it leads to better outcomes. So we have the data centers and the water and all of that stuff, which is an issue that needs to be addressed. But the AI can be used for some really cool things. And yes, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, just kind of following on what the previous two people have said, I use AI to transcribe as well. I do a lot of interviews for my stories, and transcribing them word for word and replaying the audio back and forth could take me, a 20-minute interview could take me almost an hour and a half to transcribe if I want to be accurate and true. I'll run it through Otter AI, and I would say that now it's probably about 90-95% accurate. I still go back in and make sure that the spelling of names and every other word is accurate, but it is a real time saver. AI in general, I am still trying to approach cautiously because I get the appeal. I think that there are some useful applications to be done with it, including the fish count, and then also I'm seeing AI being used in surgery, surgical procedures, medical assessments that I think could be really important and really beneficial. But I will, as a former professor here and someone who occasionally gets AI-generated material either through my search efforts or through various PR agencies, I can tell still to this day if something was written by a human versus written by AI. And AI, whatever it's doing out there, I assume it's just generating from all the multiple sources that are out there on the web when it generates its content, gets a lot of things wrong. I looked up myself once, and I think this is almost automatic for all search engines, is that you get the results that the search engine itself is designed to do, but then now almost everyone from Google to Yahoo to you name it incorporates an AI generated search. And I searched my name in my biography. It was off. It was so off in terms of when I started my career, what my bylines were at, what my heritage was, and it's just like, it scares me to think that there are people who just copy and paste whatever AI spits out and accepts it verbatim. And so I think there's still a shrewdness and a background and a familiarity that people have that AI will still struggle to grasp.
I was gonna add something to that on it. I'm glad you brought up that search engine portion of things.
The thing with the search engines as well is when you do that AI summary at the top, it is often, especially when it's news oriented, it's often getting the information from news outlets. And those news outlets that are trying to sell ads online, you're not going to the outlet, you're not clicking, they're not getting, they can't, clicks don't directly translate to money. People always think they do, and I'm like, yeah, I wish, and they're like stabbing it. But in terms of like when we say how many unique users we get, when we're telling people you're taking away those unique users when you're using that often wrong AI summary, and that is something that is causing damage to news outlets. There's been a bill down in California, we've actually tried to pass one twice here in Oregon, that would actually give money to news outlets to sort of make up for that. Hasn't made it through. Some of the news outlets that get a lot of money from Google don't want to piss off Google. So they sort of fought against it. But it is just something to think about that yes, the information is not only wrong, but it's also leading you to not click on where the information might be correct.
And that is, if you could give one piece of advice to environmental advocates and community professionals in this room, what would that be?
I feel like Kendra never gets to go first.
One piece of advice, if anyone wants my phone number, they can have it. Oh, actually, I would say calling is kind of an unusual thing. A lot of emails, everyone does email now. If an advocate called me and left a message, I would call them back so fast because that is very unusual. But yeah, I think, once again, like embracing nuance, creativity is always rewarded. It's great to not just take the normal kind of industry bad, environment good, kind of angle sometimes. And yeah, perseverance is really the name of the game. Yeah, that's what I say. And if you want my information, just come up to me.
Well, I would say that persistence is very important. Accuracy is important. But also, pitch me a story that tells me what's at stake. That's one thing that I still see missing from a lot of people's pitches is that they'll say, okay, here's this environmental issue. It could be wildfire mitigation. It could be water levels. It could be this or that. And they may present a number of charts and some data, and it could be all very beautifully stated. But one thing that really just draws me in as an empathetic reader is who's affected, what's at stake, what is the human toll of this particular issue? And kind of conversely, just kind of spinning off of that too, is that we're kind of in this age now where we have a lot of people in influential positions in government. And I'm inclined now to also have people explore what is the economic impact of environmental disaster. So you can reach a lot of people talking about how global warming is going to affect crops and food, and that will drive up prices, and people who need to feed their families are going to be affected. But there's going to be stakeholders out there, people again in influential positions of power, including our own government, who may not be as swayed by that. But if you tell them, hey, rising water levels, it's going to really destroy the waterfront property values, it's really going to play havoc with the stock market. So try to find a story that speaks to the human element. But if you're concerned about some of those stakeholders, it seems like the economic impact is going to be very important to highlight as well. That seems to be a piece of influence there that a lot of people have overlooked.
Two things. One, is built, I think, on what Brian was saying, is give me the nut graph. I'm gonna say graph very carefully because I mentioned this, a friend and I both mentioned this once at a conference, and the woman thought we were saying grab me by the nuts. That is not what I am saying. She actually wrote a letter to the editor. She was very mad. It came up in my Facebook memories, and I was like, oh God, okay, nut graph. The nut graph is the paragraph of a story that summarizes what the story is about, and it's like, we'll say it's the like why I invited you to this party. So you'll see it in longer, more detailed stories. People tend to think of the lead, that one first sentence. And then we do that for shorter stories, but for more complex stories, we literally have a paragraph that is like, I'm gonna talk about this, this, and this is why it matters. It's that core. So if you know the core of what you're trying to pitch, that helps me know what you feel is at stake. As we talked about previously, yes, I might go off and do my own thing, but it's really helpful to be like, this is, scene set, this is what's at stake, then unpack the rest of your press release. Because there's a tendency to try to jam everything step by step in the press release. Tell me what the story is about, then unschool it for me. And then also, if at all possible, help me reach those unheard voices. People want to have the spokesperson talk, and the spokespeople like to talk. That's what they're supposed to do. It's great. But I want to talk to the people on the ground. I want to talk to the people who are affected. I want to talk to that nerdy scientist who's the one that's like actually is counting the fish or is using those numbers. Like help me talk to those people, because those are really where I learn and I create a more interesting, nuanced story.
I'm a voracious reader, but not necessarily of the national news, because I'm a deeply empathic person. And I'm and I can certainly sort from misinformation. My question is, how do you choose to write in a way, what do you focus on so that you're not depressing your audience, but you're uplifting them somehow through your angle?
One type of journalism that I love doing, I'm actually going to be giving a talk at the Eastern Oregon prison about leading incarcerated folks on how to do this, is something called solutions journalism. And solutions journalism is not biased journalism. It is journalism in which, rather than only focusing on a problem, you find a solution or a potential solution to concentrate on. So for example, if you have a problem in Eugene or Lane County, but there is another state or another country, it's also called constructive journalism, is what they call them in Denmark, a place that has addressed this or has begun to address this. It can't have like a miracle save either. It can't be like, and someone came in and gave a bunch of money and the problem was solved. You really do have to sort of look at, so for example, is there a model where a group came together and figured out something to the problem, so figured out something for this problem? Is this, for example, a case where, I think one of the stories we're talking about, which again, it's not environmental, it's one of the ones I'm going to talk about with the incarcerated folks, is there was something up in Portland called Trauma Intervention Program, and they have volunteers that come in when something truly horrible has happened, and they walk people through how to deal with it. So it's like, a friend of mine is actually, they helped her daughter had died, and they were like, here's how you help her find a place for her dog, here's how you make arrangements for the body, here's how you clean the apartment, like all these things we don't think about. And we didn't have it here. And there was a guy here who was really interested in having it, and so we did a pretty in-depth solution story on how it was working elsewhere in Portland and nationally. And Lane County went, oh shoot, maybe we should fund that. So that for me is a really great way to get a positive thing. You can address that problem, but you can also look and see, like, is someone, you can't solve the whole thing, but maybe just a slice of it, and that's one of the things I like to do.
I can just go with that too, yeah. Yeah, speaking to what Camilla just said, yeah, I've been a devout follower of solutions journalism for probably about half my career now. I forget when the concept kind of came into vogue, but if you Google solutions journalism, you're going to find that there's a number of organizations that work with newsrooms and media outlets to provide a frame of producing stories that don't just present the bleak facts or the disastrous situation that a community or person may find themselves in, but what are some of the steps being done to kind of remedy that issue. And in general too, even just outside of solutions journalism, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a medical ailment, whether it is, like an epidemic, or whatever the situation is there are almost always people responding to the situation who are the helpers. I go back to my Mr. Rogers lesson that whenever something terrible happens, look at the helpers. Focus on the helpers. The event may be tragic, it may be overwhelming, but there's almost always going to be someone on hand, if not several people, who are trying to tackle it and make things better.
You guys talked about the gaslighting and bullshitting that you're experiencing from the government in modern times. But I wonder if you could talk also about the open hostility and danger that the government poses more than ever to news organizations, reporters, and your colleagues, but also your sources, whether that's a scientist reporting on some aspect of climate change and the government might come for their job, or it's some activists protesting the war in Iran and putting their safety at risk. How do you protect yourselves, your colleagues, your newsrooms, or maybe more importantly, your sources, and that trust that you need going forward with the level of hostility that we're seeing from the government in 2026?
I figure I might kick it off because I've been covering the recent protests down at the federal building, and my journalists have been down there, and my student journalists have been down there. And in fact, there was a big discussion in the journalism school if they should let the student journalists go. And I was like, y'all know they're just gonna show up, right? Like, they're gonna go. So some of the other professors helped me fundraise to buy them some gas masks that we have at the office. So when we're down there, one of my reporters, Eve, she is usually in the front lines at the protests. And she has the equipment, which is great, but one of the things we talked about when she first was doing some of her shots and video, she was like, oh, I'm very carefully, I should take a step back. One of our policies is we protect those who need protection. That is when we give anonymity. If someone faces retribution, if they face danger, we're going to give them anonymity. If like Joe Schmo, the racist, is like, I don't want my name in the paper and my mom's gonna know I'm a racist, then I'm probably gonna go ahead and put him in the paper, to be honest. But when someone who has lesser power is afraid of being arrested for their mere presence at a protest, which could happen, we're going to protect that. But when Eve came back the first time, I was like, wow, you got some great shots of the ICE agents. It looks like a little bit like a promo for ICE. And she was like, yeah, I was trying to only get the protesters from the back. And I was like, totally valid, but we also, like, one, we have to say why the protesters are there. Like, I will not knowledgeably publish a story that's just about the protest. It has to be why they are protesting. This is about immigration, this is about war. And then secondly, I'm like, see who's willing to have their picture taken, see who's willing to talk to us. There's gonna be some people who are there and they're willing to do it, and there's other people who aren't. I'm like, go in, you're in there on the front lines, go in, figure it out. Eve got hit with tear gas. My torch reporter from LCC got hit pretty badly with a pepper ball. He has a giant bruise on his leg. So probably the only faculty member who hasn't been tear gassed or pepper sprayed yet. I'm really proud of that. Not for the lack of being there. And it is a real danger, but it's also, if we're, say this again, you're not the only one who's a little slow before one, and I'm finished the first cup of coffee. If we're not there, then we can't be part of the narrative. So when they say everyone clear the courtyard, if we run away first, then if there's something happens between the protesters and the government, then you've got the two competing narratives, and we need to be there as that third narrative, that diversity of perspective. So what I've told even my other ones is when they say clear the courtyard, legally we have to leave. I'm like, back away, keep filming, hold up your press pass. Press pass doesn't save us, it just tells us that we are there to provide that voice for people. And in all honesty, the feds ought to appreciate it too, like that there is another camera there, that's part of complicating the narrative. I don't know if that kind of gets to some of what you're asking.
I'm not sure I've been faced with this situation very often in my career, but the few times that I have, as a freelancer, you want to make sure that whoever you're giving the story to, you have a really good relationship with in case that type of thing comes up with anonymity of the sources. So having a good relationship with the editor is really important, and having an editor that you trust is really important. And also I wanted to say I was so impressed when Eugene Weekly even touched that extra footage that came out of the internet, of the YouTube channel, of that window being broken. thought that was really cool that you guys actually looked into that, because not many people were taking that seriously at the time. But yeah, you know, it is, I think at that point it's all about the relationship that you have with the source, and as a journalist, I don't want to in any way threaten that relationship, because I need that to make my living. So yeah, as I said, I think that's such like a touchy thing, especially like with my freelance work, it hasn't really come up, but I do think that having those human connections with your editor is really important for that type of very touchy stuff.
Yeah, just hard to kind of top what Camilla and Kendra just said, but what I can add is that my colleagues and I at KLCC have had a lot of discussions, and actually this is kind of 2020 and the social justice protests were kind of a primer for what's happening right now in 2025 and 2026. I remember 5-6 years ago being part of some protest coverage that for the first time, instead of just fishing for my microphone and my headphones and everything else I needed for my field reporting, I was also trying to find a bike helmet and goggles and a container of water or milk in the instance that I was pepper sprayed or gassed, and then just trying to wear extra thick layers of clothing in case I got hit by a projectile. You know, and it was just kind of this strange thing to find myself. I have to consider my personal safety now. I have to safeguard against physical harm now, as opposed to just, at that point, the only thing I was worried about was a source getting terse with me. But now, you know, the physical risks are very strong. And I also have had conversations between myself and Dart Center for Trauma was a great resource for this as well, and where we talked about covering large gatherings that could turn potentially violent. You know, what kind of things do you need to do? It's like, well, don't put yourself in the center, keep yourself aware of an exit strategy, keep in touch with a news director or a colleague, sometimes report in pairs. I covered this very volatile counter-protest event at, it was a drag queen story hour. It was it Old Nick's? What was the?
It was Old Nick's now.
Yeah, yeah, and I was, you know, trying to connect with some of the other reporters who were covering the event that day, because it potentially got very ugly. There were just fights and brawls and things being thrown left and right between the protesters and counter-protesters, and I asked a couple people I knew at the Register Guard, do you mind walking me back to my car? Because there were concerns that people on both sides may be trying to harass and potentially intimidate and attack journalists as they're coming and going to these events. And yeah, my two friends at the Register Guard said, sure, no problem. They walked me to my vehicle and there's no incident. But it's really just about kind of anticipating what are the potential threats and being prepared for that. As far as talking to sources go, I tell them a lot that, you know, I'm in firm control of the story, but I cannot control how people react to the story. You know, you may get flamed in social media, you may get a lot of disparaging comments. I have no control over that. How people respond in your community, I have no control over that either. I'm just trying to do a very balanced, fair, and accurate story. If they feel like they need to be given anonymity, my editor and I will hear them out. What do you stand to lose if your name or your photograph is included in this report? You know, does that justify, does it rise to the level of anonymity or an alias? And sometimes too, you kind of have to push back a little bit on that as well. I remember when I was covering some of the 2020 social justice protests, I had a group of people say, hey, don't get our pictures in here, you know, turn your cameras to the sidewalk, you know, because we don't want to be tracked or, you know, followed. And it's like, well, I guess I kind of understand that, I'll shoot you from behind. But I noticed that a lot of times when the cameras were pointed down to the sidewalk, they started setting fire to police cruisers and storefronts. It's like, well, there's still some accountability here that's missing. So, you know, where's the fine line? But, you know, it's a case-by-case system, and you just have to, again, anticipate what are some of the risks and how do you best protect your sources and who warrants that protection.
And I think I should mention the Oregon Shield Law. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Shield Law or the Oregon Shield Law, but under the Oregon Shield Law, we have a really good Shield Law here in Oregon. Journalists do not have to reveal our confidential sources or any information that was not published. Anything that's published, you know, the FBI, like I said, they're all over our webpage right now trying to figure things out. But they cannot. In Oregon, folks cannot come after us. If I say someone is anonymous and they come to me and say, I want you to give me that name, as a journalist, I do not have to do that. So there was recently, the FBI was questioning people at some of the protests, and they went to actually a local photographer who's a really great protest photographer. And I think they thought of him as like an ordinary citizen. Under Oregon law, because he's putting information out to the public, he is actually a journalist and does not have to turn that over. The ordinary citizen or the activist, the protest who's filming, they're not protected under the law, but as journalists we are. It's a little debatable with the feds. So I did reach out to a great group called Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and they are like, yeah, this would be very fightable. And I'm like, okay, great. So they basically said if the feds did come to us and ask for any of the material, that they would step in and take the case on for us. So do know that if a journalist promises you anonymity, we are protected under law. They cannot compel us to turn it over. And if a journalist if you were to be promised anonymity and the journalist reveals your name and you suffer harm, you can sue the news outlet over that. So that is something I do tell people. I interviewed the graffiti artist Suspish. I love Suspish, they're great. And I made sure to tell Suspish that, because Suspish is definitely wanted by the police for their graffiti. And so I'm like, yeah, if you talk to me and I screw this up, then you can come after me. And they were like, not my plan, but good to know. So just do know that and that is part of the reason we take anonymity so seriously. Is it's something that there is legalities around.
Hey, thank you folks for speaking. I really appreciate it, especially before noon. And I wanted to ask, because one of the things I'm really concerned about, one of my kind of like interests is antitrust enforcement and kind of conglomeration of industries. And it seems pretty obvious that like there is money out there related to news. It's just going to like 3 or 4 places. Like you mentioned like Google, the Google results, are corralling people so they don't click on that next thing, right? And limiting that off. And I guess I was curious, which I know this is a much bigger and different conversation than reporting on just the environment, but do you folks suggest or do you promote or support any structural changes, either sort of breaking up large monopolies of information, or bringing something back like the fairness doctrine, other kind of structural approaches to changing that funding mechanism for news? Thanks.
I can't say I'm really steeped in the antitrust aspect of this, but I will say that the fairness doctrine, when it was repealed almost 40 years ago, kind of set in motion, I think, a very strong bias in a lot of media organizations. I'm thinking primarily of Fox News, which I blame a lot of current democracies' ills upon, because the news, in my opinion, from Fox and some of its imitators, like Newsmax and others, are just so slanted and so highly propagandistic that I just, it troubles me. And to this day, they still kind of play themselves as the underdog. They still say, oh, this is, the mainstream media is taking over. Well, Fox News actually is like the largest, most popular cable news network out there, but they'll never repeat that a lot. In fact, we're still seeing very questionable things happening. President Trump got a lot of grief recently when he received the war dead, and he was wearing a baseball cap with gold lettering, and a lot of people said that was very disrespectful. A lot of outlets were running that footage. Fox News somehow managed to find footage of him without the baseball cap, which they played as... It was a different... Yeah, it was from a different, I think a week or two before, where he's not wearing the cap, and Fox says, oh, our bad, we didn't realize. And, they've done this kind of thing before, back in, I think when Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin had rolled back collective bargaining about 15 years ago, almost to this week, I believe. Fox News was running footage of unruly unions, being thugs in the street. And so they showed this footage, supposedly from Madison, Wisconsin, of union activists slugging it out and throwing haymakers at each other. And some very eagle-eyed viewers noted that there were palm trees in the background. And wherever this footage was, it was not Madison, Wisconsin during February, which is a very cold, but I could spiel on forever about what the fairness doctrine did. I think it would be a great thing to bring back. Is it realistic to expect it to come back anytime soon. I don't think so in this immediate climate, but I do think that the enforcement of multiple viewpoints in a news program would be very essential, kind of restoring a little bit of balance.
Sure. There's a great documentary called Strict for Parts, which is definitely worth taking a look at, and it sort of goes into how these hedge funds bought up newspapers, not only because they wanted to control news, but because actually they literally wanted to strip them for parts. They bought the properties, the buildings the newspapers were in, so they could then sell them, and that was really a huge part of the attack upon newsrooms. News definitely needs a different funding model and a different, less conglomeration. The more you get large organizations sending out the same message, the more dangerous it is. So like when Sinclair will send out a message and tell all its stations to run that same message, that's dangerous, and it's something we need to, I don't know if repealing the fairness doctrine to that, but something we need to call out and to do something about. I will say closer to home, to my horror, I'm going to be the next owner of Eugene Weekly. That's what the previous owner before she died wanted to have happen. It's what her children have decided. And so what we are currently doing is exploring what to do about that. We are looking at having the newspaper be nonprofit owned, which is a slightly different model than going nonprofit. Nonprofit papers have certain restrictions on what they can say and what they can do. Nonprofit-owned papers do not have those same restrictions. So the Philadelphia Inquirer is owned by Lenfest, the Tampa Tribune is owned by Poynter. So when you have a nonprofit-owned news outlet, that business can continue operating in the same business model, but it also has nonprofit support. So I think looking at these different types of models, we're also looking a little bit at community purpose trust. So we're currently doing some grant funding to explore, because for us, we want the paper to be community owned. That I think is a good model for local news. It doesn't solve the question for national and international outlets, but I think on a local level, that is the direction that we want to go with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think nonprofit is a great model. I also think, like I said before, like there's a ton of journalists that are kind of doing almost like a, this is like on Substack, this is their platform and this is their journalism, and you can just pay them directly. And I think as a journalist that is kind of ideal, although it adds a whole other level of stress, definitely, to your life. But in my observations, I see a lot of times a real reluctance among people to pay for news because it's been free forever. And I understand that, and I'm not sure how to get around that impulse, because we can come up with the best funding models ever, and if no one wants to pay for it, it's not going to help, So I don't know what that, even I'm reluctant to pay for news sometimes, and I'm a journalist, so I don't know what that says, But yeah, that's an issue, and I'm not sure what the solution is to that. The nonprofit works because you do fundraising, and then, it's not necessarily tied to readership as tightly as it was with the ad model, so I like that. But I was also going to say something about, mentioning like Fox News. I think a lot of the shenanigans are on TV news. I'm kind of struggling to think of shenanigans in print. A radio, sure, I guess, but in print, I'm really kind of struggling to think of like a publication that is like so bold, like in the same way that Fox News is, about how they kind of mess around with the coverage.
New York Post.
I was just going to say,
yeah, sure. The
has
Post.
some doozies, Daily
Yeah.
Mirror.
They've covered me before, trust me.
Oh, yeah, okay. I almost wonder if it's easier to call out in print. But what I was going to say was there are some like pretty glaring legal loopholes that allow Fox News to do what it's doing. I think for the viewers, Fox News is a news station, but I think legally it's an entertainment channel. That seems like a really easy thing to address. We don't even need to overhaul the system,
Thank you. I had a question back to climate a little bit. As climate change falls out of the national conversation a little bit, or just becomes very contested, so it's not getting as much coverage, I was thinking more than, and this relates back then to Brian's point with the Indigenous fire management projects, and how maybe I just want to ask if you had any lessons from that experience, because it feels like that was one of the more recent times, and maybe it's just in my own experience, where a climate issue was seen and addressed and responded to from a ground up and all around rather objective feeling response to it. And I just wonder if you have any takeaways from that experience of targeting climate issues to get away from the argument of climate change while still addressing these problems that we're facing. And specifically with that takeaway too from that story.
Well, I certainly think that journalists have no obligation to comply with what the federal government mandates as part of the conversation or not. It's, I think whenever the press is able to push back against the restrictions and restraints that the administration tries to impose on, again, this is what they're trying to remove from all the federal agencies that it works with and touches. Free press being independent, of course, we can continue that conversation whether or not certain busybodies up in the federal government support or reject that. The conversation will continue, the relevance continues, the science is there, and I think as long as you assert that you are reporting on something that is factually accurate and science-backed, the conversation needs to continue, because if it doesn't, I think the awareness drops off the radar and people just kind of allow things like emissions and just the very factors that affect global warming to continue. I find it very gratifying because it allows me to kind of incorporate bits and pieces of my culture into the conversation. So prescribed burns are wonderful. We also talk about first foods being affected, because that's also very essential as trying to restore our ways. And then, other areas, of course, include removal of infrastructure. The big debate right now, of course, is, do we remove more dams so that salmon can migrate? And what are the benefits to that as opposed to the hydroelectric power debate that happens whenever you talk about removing these old structures? So, yeah, at least from my perspective, keep the conversation going whether or not you have support in Washington.
I just wanted to add briefly, I was a journalist in New Mexico, and I grew up in New Mexico, but anyways, one of the areas where I saw communities really come together over an issue that was very obviously climate change driven was through water. When a town runs out of water, it doesn't matter why, everybody's got to come together to figure out what to do with it. And I saw that over and over and over again, and we're actually kind of seeing that here in Oregon now too. And so it's kind of funny because, if you're the type of person who would be triggered by the idea that climate change is causing the water shortage, you can address the issue and talk about it and come up with a solution without even using that word, climate change, which is kind of interesting. Eventually, all of the abstract things about climate change are going to be very, very real. I think fire is another great example, like you mentioned, like when a town burns down, or a town, deals with that. But yeah, water seems to be very motivating, and that's really, I think there's a lot of interesting partnerships that we see come out of that, especially when we have like farmers and environmental groups on the same page, that you can't deny that the climate is a piece of that, but it almost becomes obsolete because you need a solution. And I just think that's kind of interesting that I'm observing.
I think the only thing I have to add on that is I think people were writing about climate change before climate change became that, the essential issue that it's become. I don't see that changing. I worry a lot about access to information because as they shut down government research and as funding gets shut down to universities and that type of thing, I think it's just more important than ever that we make sure that the scientific voices are heard and that are heard louder than the people shouting that climate change isn't